You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Deer hunting and deer herd management, all that and everything in between today on the show with the co-director of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab, Bronson Strickland.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
We are talking deer. Big ones, little ones, all points in between, and what makes those big ones on the Mississippi Outdoor Podcast here with Bronson Strickland from the MSU Deer Lab. Bronson, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you. You've been looking forward to this, as I know a lot of people have, and you're co-director there at the MSU Deer Lab, and we were talking just a minute ago, been at it for a pretty good little while, haven't you?
Yeah, a couple decades. Getting old.
Yeah. Well, not really. You know, that's just experience. But you came to the MSU Deer Lab late 90s.
Yeah, actually got here in 1998. Worked for Steve Damaris, and that worked out really, really well. I got my PhD with Steve, and then I was lucky enough to get a job on faculty there later. And Steve and I have been working together as co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab ever since.
Ever since.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that y'all work closely would kind of be an understatement.
A vast understatement, yeah.
So this is a broad question, but it might be the kind of question you'd get, say, in an airport if you bump into a stranger and they find out about the MSU Deer Lab and they say, well, what is that? What do you do?
That is a good question and a
question.
Common question. Essentially what we do is, well, first of all, we're lucky to be partners with MDWFP. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really special environment because MDWFP will have an issue, a problem relative to hunters, landowners, et cetera. MSU will be the research arm for MDWFP. And so a lot of those questions involve deer. And so it's MDWFP, like now William McKinley, for example, the deer coordinator. Mm-hmm. We'll work together. We'll design a project together, how we're going to lay it out, how we're going to analyze the data. But ultimately, too, what is it going to mean to hunters and landowners and stakeholders? So we take that part very, very serious about it's not just the science and the journal articles for publication, but what is it going to mean to people, and how do we get that information in their hands?
That's really interesting. I've got this parallel in my mind because just earlier today I was talking about a guy who was my teammate at State named Reuben Birch, and he's over in the athlete engineering world, you know, performance, getting bigger, stronger, running faster for athletes, and that's sort of directed at the participant.
Yeah.
This is kind of similar in that it's all about that buck and all about, you know, the environment and that kind of thing. But really the end goal is the user, the hunter.
That's right.
And the landowner. So it's actually another step built into this whole engineering process, isn't it, so to speak?
Yeah. So it's about the stewardship and the conservation of the resource, of course.
Yeah.
But then it's also working with the landowner and what do they want to accomplish? And then us helping give them the information to help them accomplish their objective.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's really cool. Mm-hmm. As far as your background, we mentioned you got to State late 90s, 98. Kind of how this all developed for you, taking me way back to your interest in the outdoors to finding your way to the MSU Deer Lab.
Well, I'm really lucky, and I'm very serious when I say that. I'm really, really lucky because this was the only thing I ever wanted to do. So I was not a teenager or even a college student still trying to find my way and figure out what I wanted. When I was in junior high, I learned that there was such a thing as a deer biologist. And I was focused on that. Nothing was going to get in my way. Nothing was going to stop me. So I grew up in Georgia. And so I got my undergraduate at the University of Georgia. And then I left Georgia and I went to South Texas. So Texas A&M, Kingsville. And I got to work on a little 60,000 acre ranch that focused on trophy deer management.
Very cool.
So I got to learn, understand deer and deer management in a completely different environment. And then as I was graduating there, I saw this job advertisement from Steve Damaris at Mississippi State. And so the goal was, well, that's halfway home. You know, we're going to go from Texas and we wanted to get back to Georgia. But we got to Mississippi State and everything just worked out so well that we've never left.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
So you doubled up on the bulldogs.
I'm a double dog. That's right.
Double dog. All right. And so this is of the many, many things, research projects and cool things that y'all have done at the Deer Lab over the years. This is just one. I saw this video recently of a program called Doe's Choice.
Yeah.
And without, I guess, telling, and giving it all away, this involved figuring out in a very unique way, or trying to figure out and doing research on, does a doe prefer a buck as a mate with big antlers or small, or does it matter at all?
Yeah.
That's kind of where we start. That's just one example, but talk about that process.
Sure. So this was a spirited debate that Steve and I had over the years. And so, not to get into too much ecological theory and stuff, but essentially, a female has a lot on the line when she is the one investing so much in her offspring. So she gets bred, and then she has to gestate. So then she has to create these little deer, and then she has to lactate and feed them. It is to her benefit to choose a male that, at least based on her appearance or assessment, is going to be a good father, genetically. That I want to mate with him. He will most likely have good offspring. Well, for the longest time, there had never been any type of study done where we could assess whether a female is choosing in any form or fashion a mate. It was always just thought that when she comes into estrus, it is going to be the male that is there is going to breed her. So the way we had always thought was the female isn't choosing per se, but it is a byproduct of the male. So males are going to compete against each other, and the victor is going to have breeding rights. So indirectly, she was choosing by accepting a breeding opportunity from a male who had won. So what we decided to do is that antlers, again, ecologically, they have always been thought of as a signal of animal quality. And what that means is that antlers are an indicator of age, number one. Yearling bucks are not going to have 150 inches of antler. Antlers are also, if they're really large, a lot of people will say, well, it's just good genetics. It also means that this buck survived to an older age and was also really good at acquiring food resources to be able to grow such a set of large antlers. So if you're an animal like a doe and you want an instant assessment of, is this buck probably older and in good shape or not, instantaneously, if he's got a big rack, it's a pretty good indicator. So, Matt, what we did was we set up a scenario to where we had to manipulate antler size. And so with all the different sizes and ages and packages that a deer could come, we had to partition, is a doe looking at the buck's body size? Is there a way she can assess his age independent of the antler size? So we had to manipulate that. So we would take a series of bucks. Some would be a little bit younger, some would be mature, and we would make sure that these two bucks that we were evaluating were either the same age or either the exact same, within a few pounds, body size. So they're both, for example, 200-pound bucks. And then we have one buck that has really large antlers, let's say 160 inches of antler, and one that, a little bit smaller, 100 inches of antler. And so then we were able to switch and manipulate that. So we took the large antlers off the big guy and put them on the same size buck that had the smaller antlers and switch them up. And so we did this over and over again. And it was a lot harder than it may seem because we had to get with the engineering department, for example. So how do we come up with this coupling here where we can take an antler off and get an epoxy and put it in here and engineer? Which is
fascinating to me, by the way.
Yeah. And that was a lot of it, figuring that out.
Well, and so I saw the video. So that part of it. So a deer is, it goes to sleep and wakes up with this giant set of antlers that he didn't go to sleep with, because there's this metal coupler, totally healthy. It's above the base. He's going to shed those anyway.
Yeah.
where you can say, okay, we're putting these large, thick, broad antlers, on this deer now, and then a smaller set over here, and then actually disguising it with a certain, antler colored tape so that it wouldn't throw the doe off for some reason, right?
Right. Yeah. We tried to make the color look like it was antler and not aluminum or stainless steel or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing is fascinating to me. And just the time and ability and resources to do that kind of research. That's not happening just anywhere, is it?
Years of planning to make that happen.
And you monitored her, the doe's activity or sort of her inclination towards one buck or the other 24 hours a day for how long?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we had, of course, with science, you can't just do one trial.
Right.
We had to do this over and over again with all of the adult females, all the adult does in our captive herd. And so what we're able to do, just like in livestock, is you can synchronize estrus. So you can basically give them a hormone that will induce the estrus cycle in them. And so when we were ready to have a trial or an evaluation, is we would do that hormone injection in the doe. And so then we would know that, okay, now she is in heat and in standing heat, meaning she is receptive. Well, we know when she is receptive, she's going to have a lot of behavioral clues and signals that she wants to breed.
Yeah.
She's standing still and her tail is moved out of the way. And so what we would do is we would release that female. She would go down an alley. And when she got to the end of that alleyway, to her left, for example, was this 160-inch buck, and to her right was this 100-inch buck. And then we monitored her behavior either by literal observation, we're watching, but because this is happening all the time, we're video recording it. So it might be, 3 o'clock in the morning. But then in every case, we could determine if she sided one way or the other and behaved as if she is standing there to be bred. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was over 80%, I believe, of the time, maybe close to 90. She always went to the larger antlered buck.
Yeah. And so some research like that, final question on that would be, how conclusive is something like that? Let's just say for, the end user, for in that research, how conclusive, how clear of a conclusion do you come to from stuff like that?
I think it was a sound conclusion. The issue is now we have reality.
Yeah.
Is that, does aren't choosing in that manner. But kind of what it demonstrated was ecologically, when she could, that is what she would favor. Mm. And that the signal that we thought was a viable signal, antler size, that she was cueing on that, and that was her preference.
Yeah. It's so fascinating.
So it just kind of confirms some ecological theory that we think that's the way she should behave.
Yeah.
And 80 to 90% of the time, that's the way she did.
That big rack has an effect on her.
That's right.
And I've tried to figure out maybe, what's the human parallel? Would it be, a big head of hair? Because I'm struggling in that regard also.
This doesn't translate to humans, Matt. So
good.
Don't worry about that.
I'm glad to know that. But you said a word in there which is kind of the guts of, that's one test, one type of test, genetics, which any landowner, anybody that's a hunter, they've studied it, read about it, wondered about it, asked you about it. Genetics. Is that the thing, or is it the environment, the food source where he lives? Like that topic, is that topic A probably for what you do?
Probably so. In terms of someone being bewildered about why don't we have big deer, it's either why don't we have big deer or why aren't our deer as big as their deer?
Yeah.
It's always a comparison. It typically always, what's wrong with our genetics? How do we fix this genetic problem? Or we only have 8-point genetics. Statements like that are very, very common.
Sure. Where do you go with that? Where do you fall in that?
Well, my answer is that has been shown by research, by others, and especially what we've done at MSU with a project with MDWFP, my answer is Genetics absolutely determine the morphology, meaning the size, shape, etc., of an individual. You are born with your genetics. There's nothing you can do about it. It's never going to change. Those are your genetics. So yes, genetics will influence an individual, but genetics are not affecting a population. So within that population, if you look at whatever physical attribute you're going to measure, it could be height, it could be antler size, it could be body weight, whatever, it will follow a frequency distribution that's a bell-shaped curve. Meaning there's going to be an average, for humans, if we were going to do man height, it's going to be 5'11" or something like that.
Average, yeah.
That's going to be the most frequent height of all men in the population. But there's very few, the right-hand tail of that distribution, there's very few of them, but there's Shaquille O'Neal.
Right.
They're 7-footers. But that's not the average. There's very few of those. Shaquille O'Neal is a Boone and Crockett buck. So there's bucks that score 170, 180, 190 and above, but that's not the average. So whenever we look at what is causing, where is the peak of that curve for a population, it's not genetics. It's always nutrition. Nutrition is affecting the top of that bell-shaped curve in every instance that's ever been looked at.
So then when you key in on nutrition, now you're in a whole different realm of research and development for landowners, right?
Yeah. So now you've got things you can do.
Right.
Because you can affect and improve nutrition. There's no fixing genetics.
Right. So, the curiosity just goes all over the place. So, you mentioned your time in Texas, a different type of environment than most landowners in Mississippi,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
So as it pertains to environment, what are the major differences, for a novice, someone listening, when you look at someone who owns land in that part of Texas versus someone who owns land in the Pine Belt here?
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
Well, it's really interesting. So, of course, over the years, we have measured for all the regions in Mississippi, what is the average antler size of mature bucks in all those regions. And because of my experience in South Texas, what we would do down there, and it's commonly done now, but back in the day, in the 90s, this wasn't done very often, but it was a ranch with resources and a ranch that also engaged in research. And so every fall, as part of their deer survey, they would also do a deer capture. And that essentially means you got a helicopter pilot and a net gunner, and the very first buck they see, if they see antler, then you shoot it, you wrap it up, and you go age it and measure the antlers and turn it loose. So on that very ranch that every year was killing Boone and Crockett bucks, on that very ranch where they were killing 200-inch bucks, they killed a 230-inch buck. So every hunter's dream, the type of bucks they are producing there. But the average antler size on that big ranch was less than the average antler size of bucks from the Mississippi Delta.
Is that right? Wow.
And very similar to the average antler size of bucks in the lower coastal plain of Mississippi.
Wow.
So they are able to let the very best bucks, remember the very infrequent bucks that are really, really good, they're allowed them to get to the age of 6, 7, 8. They protect them the entire way.
Very intentionally.
Absolutely intentionally. And they harvest it when he's mature. But so often in the Southeast, if we get him to 3.5 and he looks good at 3.5, and I'm not being judgmental here, if that is what you want to do, if that is part of your recreation, that's what makes you, so be it. But you just have to recognize when you're asking yourself the question, why do we never produce 150s, 160s, 170s? My answer is, you do, you just harvest them 2 years early. All the bucks that had the greatest chance to be a 150 or above gets harvested when he's 3.5.
3.5.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? And, it makes someone like me think, okay, well, there's maybe not an information gap, maybe a communication gap. It's people having a chance to do what I'm doing, talk to you, ask those questions. So from the 90s until now, email, social media, all these things, that type of information from the Deer Lab, is it more available now than really it's ever been for landowners?
Absolutely it is. And so many, I mean, it's gratifying to know that so many hunters are aware of how to manage deer and how to do that. The problem, Matt, is that in the example I gave you in South Texas, and that's just one example, that was a 60,000 acre land holding.
Yeah.
The problem here, the issue here is you don't have enough area that is under a particular type of management uniformly where you can do that. So you've got 1,000 acres around here. That's a big chunk of land.
Yeah.
But in terms of managing a buck herd, you still have dispersal events, you have excursions during deer season, and then those bucks go off your property, and your neighbor, they have a different management plan. Mm-hmm. They are absolutely tickled pink with killing a 3-year-old that scores 132. Mm-hmm. And so that is the demise of your success, is because you're not controlling enough acres, or you don't have enough people around you that have the same mindset and the same goals you have. So they just control acreage, and by controlling acreage, they control the population. And we have so many people with different opinions and management objectives. That's why it's hard for us to have the same success.
Right. It's really interesting. And Bronson, so many people managing different sizes of property and interest in the sport of deer hunting. Even though that's a challenge, isn't that what makes Mississippi like a really cool place to be for an outdoorsman?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the Southeast, but Mississippi, I think, is just really unique about our hunting heritage. And in terms of the turkey population, you go to the river and the waterfowl. I mean, there are just so many opportunities in Mississippi to make it unique.
Yeah. We kind of run up on that theme, it seems like, whether it's talking turkey hunting or fishing and fishing opportunities. State of Mississippi with, a little less than 3 million population total per capita, the outdoor opportunities that we have in this state, it's kind of like producing football talent per capita. It's really second to none here. Mm-hmm. And I would guess, even with its in the sport of deer hunting and in managing deer herds, probably find that as well in the research, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So that, that's the demise of a lot of managing big acreage is human population and subdivisions and all that sort of stuff. So it is unique. I mean, that's an asset that we have in terms of we don't have urban sprawl throughout the entire state. So we have a lot of areas where we can manage really big swaths of land for wildlife.
Yeah.
So that certainly helps a lot. It also helps if you ever get on a realtor website, go to Illinois or Iowa and look at price per acre, and then come back to Mississippi. We're lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really cool place in that way also.
Yeah.
Bronson, as far as, someone that has a question and maybe they're curious and they hear that Mississippi State's got this Deer Lab and you're there and the other folks are there and, decades of experience, and can they just pick up the phone and call you?
That they can, but I'm going to caution them.
Okay.
Probably the most inefficient way to get a hold of me is with phone call to my office.
Is old fashioned?
I'm just out and about so often, and then you have to go in and catch up with voicemail. But I am very good about email. So yeah, if you go to the MSU Deer Lab website, my email's there. My phone number's there too, but my email's there, and so is Steve's. And we welcome you to send us a note, ask us a question. We'll get back to you as soon as possible.
Cool.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you foresee out in the future, 5, 10 years for the average hunter in Mississippi that, are some of the obvious issues that we're going to be dealing with and talking about going forward in terms of managing whitetail deer in Mississippi? What do you see there?
Well, the big one is reconciling CWD and the impacts that is going to have. And I didn't say maybe or might, the impacts that disease is going to have. And, it's an interesting and troubling, in my opinion, phenomenon of how, for my opinion, something that is so obvious of a threat to our deer herd, but there is so much misinformation and doubt about that we're making this up. This is some kind of government conspiracy. I mean, there's just so much about this disease, which is decidedly different from other diseases like hemorrhagic disease or blue tongue. And I really believe that it's something people believe in blue tongue and hemorrhagic disease because it's immediate, it's tangible. Is that they can go out one year, find some dead deer, 5 deer, 20 deer, whatever. A disease event happened, deer died, they can see it. Versus chronic wasting disease, you may not see anything wrong for a decade. It may be 2 decades, but it is slowly, unfortunately, inching its way south. So you're, of course, familiar with the North Mississippi, where we have the CWD zone and other instances are popping up. Unfortunately, I think that's just going to become more and more frequent. And what do we do about it? How do we work together?
Right. Fair to say, again, 10,000 feet, just kind of looking at that, another great advantage for the state of Mississippi in that you have something like the MSU Deer Lab that is partnering with the state agency
right
as we begin to go through it, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And just keep in mind, I mean, we're trying to do, as researchers and educators, we're trying to do everything we can to keep Mississippi's deer population thriving, where you can harvest it, where you can manage it. And so is MDWFP. I mean, that is their conviction to make sure that this resource is around for us and our kids and our grandkids. So sometimes, though, the treatment or the medicine may sting in the short term, but we got to think about this in the long term. Yeah. And that's not to say either we may make mistakes. In science, there's always going to be some mistakes. With a question that's really, really big, and you get the privilege of having hindsight 20 or 30 years down the road, there may be. I mean, I completely predict, Matt, that we're going to go, you know what? I wish we had done that a little bit different.
Sure.
But in the grand scheme of things, I think we're headed in the right direction for CWD management.
Yeah. For you, I look at you, here's a guy from Georgia, who really early on knew this is what he wanted to do. And here you are in 2024 and have sort of spent a career neck deep involved in anything and everything. I guess, first of all, the obvious thing that jumps out at me is how cool it is for your story. A kid that in sixth grade can go, this is what I want to do. And you look up and at this point in your career, this is what you're doing. There's a real blessed nature to that. And I'm sure
Absolutely.
There's other sixth graders out there who look at it and go, hey, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So lucky. I mean, gratitude. There's so many ways I was lucky. Number one, I was born at a time where there was this profession called a deer biologist. And I was lucky enough to be born in a part of the country where 15 minutes away was a land-grant university that had that degree that I could go after, So, and I was lucky enough to have parents that deer biology, you're going to do what? But they supported me. They supported that endeavor. Because I got a lot of questions. Something brand new, like, what are you doing? They're expecting the conventional profession and, you're going to go study deer. Yeah. How are you going to make a living doing that? So very lucky all the way around to have those opportunities.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, where the genesis was, who introduced you at an early age, but I guess you just answered it. Dad, mom, granddad, somebody introduced you to the outdoors.
It was actually, I remember where I was standing. It's so silly. I was with a friend that was in Boy Scouts. And the guy, my friend, was buddies with the guy, and his name was Buck.
Okay.
Buck Marshington. Well, Buck Marshington was the son of Larry Marshington, the deer biologist professor at the University of Georgia.
Wow.
And so that's how I learned about this profession. And here's luck again. When I went to the University of Georgia, guess who my advisor was? And nobody was doing home cooking and assigning. My advisor was Larry Marshington.
How about that?
So I got to work with him under his wing and at the UGA deer pens and do all that sort of stuff. So I got really lucky.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And he named his son Buck.
He named his son Buck. Yeah. Yeah.
We get where that comes from,
right.
for sure.
Absolutely.
And that is really cool. Really neat story. Well, and I know you didn't come here to get a pat on the back or anything like that, but I do think that there are probably a lot of people that would reach through, the podcast venue, however they're listening on their phone, and shake your hand and say, hey, thanks to you guys for the work and the research over the years. I'm sure you get that too sometimes, don't you?
Yeah, we certainly do. We certainly do. But it means so much to us. I mean, again, us recognizing how privileged we are to be able to work with the deer and do research on deer, and then to get to tell the story, the educational outreach about it.
Sure.
It's so good for us simultaneously.
Yeah, it really is. So for anyone listening, give me that contact information in case they want to.
Sure thing. You could reach out and get us at the MSU Deer Lab. So just do MSU Deer Lab on Google and it will pop up. And there's websites there, social media as well, Facebook, YouTube channel, Instagram, all that. And then you can also reach me at wildlifeinvestments.com.
Perfect. Wildlifeinvestments.com. Bronson, thanks so much. Great to see you. Appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Happy to.
Yeah, that's Bronson Strickland here on the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you outdoors.